Hello, I'm Dr. George Cressman. I'm the staff historian here at the Camp Landing Museum. We most appreciate that you're watching this video, another one in a series of Camp Landing history videos. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the development of medium tanks that were used by primarily the U.S. and the British during World War II. I'm standing in front of the museum's Sherman Tank, and this is the tank that we'll focus in as we walk through this video. The first tanks that the U.S. Army were used in World War I, but they were French tanks. They were manufactured in French facilities. The U.S. essentially had no on-purpose designed tanks during World War I. During the interwar period then, between World War I and World War II, there was a controversy that arose in the U.S. Army, and that was, what was the real purpose of tanks? Were they to function like cavalry and do scouting missions? Or were they primarily designed to support infantry attacks? Now that controversy never got resolved even into World War II. As a matter of fact, most of the tanks deployed by the U.S. Army in World War II were used for infantry support. The Army deployed during World War II both light tanks and medium tanks. For the U.S., the medium tank started with the M3. M3 tank was a unique design that was very competitive, was a very good tank early on against German tanks. So they were used quite extensively in North Africa. And they were used by both U.S. Army and by the British Army. The M3 tank that was used by the British Army was called the Grant. The M3 tank that was used by the U.S. was called the Lee. Now the challenge with the M3 was that although it had a relatively good main gun, a 75 millimeter gun, it was relatively slow and it did not have a rotating turret. So to traverse the gun for extensive movement, you had to actually move the tank itself. And that made it difficult to deploy the tank in rapidly evolving combat. So there was an effort then to develop a new medium tank, and that's where we get the M4. So the M4, named the Sherman Tank by the U.S., became the main medium tank during World War II. The M3 was a stopgap solution. The design of a new medium tank was begun in April of 1941. The Armored Force was shown 5 potential models of new medium tanks and eventually settled on this one, what became the Sherman. So the prototype was labeled the M4 medium tank. Initially, the tank had a cast turret and a cast hull. Those were ultimately replaced by welded turrets, welded hulls. The cast hull version was subsequently named the M4A1. And our tank here at Camp Landing is an M4A1. It was built by the Lima Locomotive Works, and these were produced the Shermans were produced beginning in October of 1941. And by the end of World War II, the U.S. had produced over 70,000 M4 version tanks. These tanks, the Sherman tanks, were labeled. They were all M4s, but then they were labeled as with various modifications. The modifications were not necessarily differences in or linear improvements in tank capability. They were just different manufacturing methods and had different features. So the Museum Sherman, as I commented, was the M4A1 and manufactured by the Lima Locomotive Works. You see in this chart the statistics that describe the M4A1 tank. So the M4A1 tank, the Sherman M4A1, weighed 33 tons. It was almost 20 feet long, and could reach speeds of 21 miles an hour on level ground. So here we are at Camp Landing's Sherman M4A1 Sherman Tank. You'll notice the cast hull, the cast turret, typical of the M4A1s. But there are a number of very interesting aspects of this tank that have a mix of features that were relevant to later designs of the tanks. One of those features that's very different is the gun itself. So most of the M4A1 Sherman tanks were built or fitted with a 75 millimeter gun. There was no muzzle brake on the gun, but the gun that's on the Camp Landing Sherman tank is a 76 millimeter gun. Late in World War II, to get more firepower into the Sherman tank, there was a conversion to a 76 millimeter gun. And all of those 76 millimeter guns had muzzle brakes on them. So the Camp Landing Sherman tank has a 76 millimeter gun in it. It has the barrel of the gun has been threaded for a muzzle brake, but the muzzle brake is not on the gun at this point. So one of the unique features of Camp Landing Sherman tank is its suspension system. Early on, the M4A1 Shermans were all fitted with something called a VVSS, a vertical volute spring suspension system. But our M4A1 has the later suspension system on it. This is a horizontal volute suspension, spring suspension system. Vertical suspension systems, up and down as the name implies. Camp Landing's suspension, tank suspension, is the horizontal spring suspension system. The horizontal volute spring suspension system allowed some weight reduction in the tank, and it allowed the tank to apply less pressure on the ground, which made it easier for this tank to traverse soft or spongy soil. It's most likely that when this tank was initially manufactured that it had the vertical volute suspension system on it. And that at some point later in the tank's existence, the tank was retrofitted with the horizontal volute spring suspension system. The HVSS, the horizontal system, was purposely designed so it could be changed so that tanks with a vertical system could be easily changed to the horizontal system. Another feature of the Camp Landing Sherman tank is on the turret of the tank. And you notice there's a port right on the side of the turret. That's a pistol port. It was designed to allow tank crews to have some close-in support, fire support. So if somebody tried to climb on the tank tank crews could open that port and fire a pistol at that person trying to climb. There was a problem with that pistol port. It was almost impossible to close it up properly to keep it from being opened from the outside. So early on in the design of the Shermans, that pistol port was removed. But the fact that we have a pistol port on our Sherman tank indicates this was a very early turret, not consistent with the later suspension system, but an early turret that is consistent with the M4A1 Sherman. So one other feature of the Camp Landing Sherman tank that I want to point out is at the end of the turret itself. And you see the turret with the piece that slopes up on the back of the turret. That's called a high bustle turret. And so initially, the end of the turret had what was called a low bustle turret, and as the experience developed with the Sherman tank, they began to go to this high bustle turret because that allowed easier access to the engine area itself in the tank. The M4 Sherman proved to be an effective tank in North Africa. It complemented the M3 and eventually became the dominant tank in North Africa. But this success against German tanks in North Africa spurred the Germans to develop a whole new series of tanks. By mid-1943, the Sherman itself was not the best tank in the field, but the U.S. was able to produce huge numbers of these tanks through mass production techniques. As you recall, I commented by the end of World War II, 11 manufacturers in the United States had produced over 70,000 of the Sherman tanks. Later versions of the M4 Shermans were upgunned, as the museum's particular tank has been upgunned to the 76 millimeter. And later, there was the introduction of the Pershing tank, which began the demise, the retirement of the Sherman tank. Interestingly, while later in the war, the Sherman had become increasingly vulnerable to mines, gunfire, and the German counterpart to the bazooka, crew survivability was very good in the Sherman tank. Sherman tanks had very large hatches, making escape from a disabled tank relatively easily. Post-war analysis indicated that about 30% of the disabled Sherman tanks had been burned out. The majority of those burnouts actually occurred in North Africa. By the time this tank got to Italy and then on to Western Europe through the Normandy invasion, ammunition storage on the Sherman had been changed. It went from what was called a dry storage to a wet storage, where the ammunition was actually held in a liquid medium inside the tank. This greatly reduced the number of burnouts that happened with the Sherman itself. Interestingly, the Adjutant General's report on World War II casualties indicates that in all of World War II, 1,578 crew members, tank crew members, were killed in action. That gives a mortality rate of about 3% for tank crews versus 18% for infantry. The majority of tank crews who were killed in action during World War II were actually killed after the crew had dismounted, had left a disabled tank. All considered, serving in a Sherman tank was generally a much safer occupation than serving in the infantry. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this video on the Sherman tank that's held here in the Camp Banding collection. We most appreciate your spending your time with us today to watch this video, and we encourage you to visit us at Camp Blanding. We're open every day in the museum from noon to 4, and we welcome you to walk around our memorial garden here where all of our equipment is held. So for our museum staff and our wonderful volunteers, this is Dr. George Cressman signing off.